I would teach some of my favorite stuff about Sukkot very quickly. And I love Sukkot. I think it's fascinating. Studying the Mishnah and the Talmud of it is also amazing. It's actually one of the best things when you have one of the Talmuds that has all the drawings in the back about how you can actually build it and how you cannot. And if it's so small that only part of your body can fit in, how should you do it? The answer is you should put your head in there and make sure that's okay. Right, there are so many interesting ways because they really want to make this holiday accessible, the rabbis do. And so I always like to talk about some of the sukkahs that we might not know about. Right? I think for a lot of us now, we think of our sukkahs as the ones that we have at our home or the ones here at the synagogue, right? There's a pretty standard way. But that wasn't necessarily the case beforehand. And so I always also like to start my teaching on if you ever forget maybe how many walls you need for a sukkah, you just need to look at the Hebrew word sukkah itself because it tells you, it gives you a cheat sheet in the name. So your samech has 4 sides to it, and then therefore it's 4 sides for a sukkah. Your kaf is open on one, so you have 3. That is also a valid sukkah for your number of walls. And then the hay, which is 2 and just a little bit, I call it the doorway, then that is also valid for your sukkah. So you can always, if you always are wondering, how should I build my sukkah? Just look at the word and you're already on a good step towards building it. But I wonder, how tall do you think is too tall for a sukkah? This is the participation part. So, how tall do you think is too tall for a sukkah? You can give it to me in feet, even though the rabbis give it to us in cubits. But how tall do you think? 14 feet, okay? 20 feet? Too tall to get the sock. So as tall as your tallest ladder. So the answer actually is, they talk about that a sukkah that is taller than 20 cubits, so cubit, if you're trying to remember, so about 18 inches, is considered too tall. That is invalid. So in feet, we're talking about 30 feet in the air. Yeah. Why would we think that potentially is too tall, besides the having to put stock up there? I hope you have good insurance for your workers if they're doing it for you. But why?
The wind could get it over.
Okay, wind could get it over. Why else?
The amount of lumber may make it too expensive for poor people.
Okay, right, too expensive. I was wondering, it's a lot of lumber then, it's a lot of cost, especially now also we know that there's some cost of products to use built up is going up. Too tall, right? So that is also talking about another issue. If we talk about walls, right, the whole other thing that mentions in this Mishnah, and this is coming from Mishnah 1 of Sukkah, it says you need the issue of lighting, all right? And so if you have walls that are too tall, it might have an issue with getting sunlight in. Great. Is this supposed to be a permanent structure?
No.
Everything that you all were saying are real concerns. Could you imagine the reinforcement you would have to do to be able to make sure that you have a sukkah that can actually withstand some wind, right? And so it's really interesting that they say it's too tall, right? And there are lots of different reasons. I also think, though, there's also a little bit more of a humbling aspect, right? You don't want to have the biggest sukkah, right? It's the Tower of Babel sort of all over again. Sometimes you might be inclined to be like, well, I have to have the biggest sukkah. I have to have this, right? And so I think there's also this idea of sort of saying like there is a limit to this aspect as well. And so that is one aspect that I love, because could you imagine seeing 30-foot sukkahs around your neighborhood or even at your synagogue? I think it would be a little bit much. Now, there's also one that is my favorite. And so who here has seen a sukkah built on top of a sukkah? Right, no one probably, right? And yet, the rabbis, I love when the rabbis play this hypothetical game. And it's really just this idea, sometimes I think it's mental flexing by the rabbis to be able to try and imagine this. But we actually talk about it in the second Mishnah of Sukkot. It says, regarding a sukkah that is on top of a sukkah, the top one is valid, and the bottom one is invalid. And Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if there's no one lodging in the top one, then the bottom one is valid. Which again, I start to ask myself, why on the world, if you're not lodging in the top one or using the top one, would you build it that way anyways? But it's really interesting just to sort of think about, again, right? It's funny almost to imagine, right? I mean, maybe one I actually was going to do this with my students in 7th grade to have them build these sort of weird ones on Minecraft. So to see what they could kind of make and have it look interesting, right? Because that's probably the only world that we're going to live in and see these sort of structures, right? But it's really interesting. But it's really fun to then be like, well, the rationale is if somebody's living up there, then the bottom one can't be valid because you can't see through it. You can't have that in order for it to be that way. Right. Yet, and the way I said it is like, what if your top sukkah is valid, essentially you built in storage, right? You built a basement for your sukkah, essentially, which is sort of another weird way to think about it. But it's just, I always love these sort of little stories. And one of the other ones that I really want to share is this one, well, two of them. But, so one is here. So, this one is, who here has any animals? Dogs, cats, horses, no horses, oh, but animals. They actually ask a question. This is now coming from the Talmud. However, if one utilized his animal as a wall for a sukkah and did not establish the entire sukkah on top of the animal, because we're going to talk about that as well, Rabbi Meir deems it unfit, but Rabbi Yehuda deems it fit. And Rabbi Meir would say, with regard to an animate object, one may neither establish it for the wall of a sukkah, use it for doing our eruv. We can't use it for putting up sort of the areas around a well to make it a private domain. And so it's interesting, though, why might we, it also says you can't write bills of divorce on animals as well. That's the other little thing they slide into there. I guess that was, we only parchment when they're not, I guess, alive. I guess it's an interesting thing. Maybe that's why they got there. I always thought
Kicking the dog, right?
Right. And so, but this idea of just being able to use an animal of it is interesting. But it comes to an interesting place because, as it alluded to in here, it talks about how actually you're able to try and build it on top of an animal, if it's okay. For certain animals, it's okay, right? And we could get into all of the different nuance about which ones are okay and which ones not. But the point that I mentioned this all for is just how amazing we try and make this holiday accessible. Because I really do think the reenactment piece of it, right, which I haven't talked about, right? This idea of we were building these temporary structures as we were potentially traveling through the desert and trying to experience this and reenact this. I always love when our tradition gives us different ways to experience the holidays. I always talk about it from a teaching standpoint. Right? Some people are great at listening and hearing the laws that way. Some people are great at reading and visual learners, and that's one way. But my favorite type of learning is kinesthetic learning. The ones where you do. The ones where you get involved. The ones where you experience. As we know, experiential Judaism and experiential teaching is something that's growing. And this is our greatest example. From the shaking of the lulav and etrog to the building of these temporary dwellings, we are meant to experience. And also sometimes have some mental fun and mental gymnastics with these structures that we couldn't even imagine. But I just wanted to teach you on a couple of different aspects of Sukkot, a couple of different sukkahs that you might not have even known existed as being okay for this holiday. And so with that, again, Boker Tov, Shana Tova, and may it be a fantastic Sukkot. May you experience it in many different ways.